Good evening, Dungeon Masters. I'm Baron Durop. Finally flush with cash thanks to the incidental marketing Stranger Things has provided Wizards of the Coast, the D&D game publisher is finally fulfilling my childhood RPG dreams. As part of the release of 1D&D, Wizards of the Coast is launching a fully integrated virtual tabletop. This new experience will feature fully interwoven character building, environment rules engines, and tools for lazy dungeon masters. And just the pre-alpha looks amazing already. But these are my childhood dreams. And children lack the wisdom and foresight to understand how this seemingly small development will likely have negative impacts on the tabletop role-playing community for generations to come. Longtime viewers of my channel will know that communication philosopher Marshall McLuhan is one of my all-time heroes. Penning the maxim, "the medium is the message," in his book Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, McLuhan discusses how the mediums we use to express our ideas irrevocably shapes the way we interact with those ideas. Or, in simple terms, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Therefore, in order to cater to the mobile user from birth, younger generation, it only makes sense that Wizards of the Coast would develop a vertically integrated virtual tabletop for Dungeons & Dragons. And that's even ignoring cultural shifts toward virtual collaboration due to the pandemic. This was inevitable. Teenagers were already highly comfortable with this stuff in 2017. The issue with WotC's in-house VTT development, however, is that for the past half-century, Dungeons & Dragons has been played around a table with friends and family, and largely without the concept of mobile devices or virtual tabletops existing in the D&D zeitgeist at all. Therefore, Wizards of the Coast pivoting from a tabletop-first to a virtual-first business model, and yes, they're absolutely going to do that. The 1D&D VTT wouldn't be worth the investment to shareholders as a side project, would mean that younger kids who are introduced to D&D for the first time will see these fully integrated virtual game systems running in their browser and will immediately be glued to the video game-like nature of the whole ecosystem. Obviously, I'm aware virtual tabletops have existed in the past. Roll20 has been around since 2012 after all, but never have these platforms had such direct and clear access to players that the 1D&D project will enjoy. New players will receive marketing flyers for the new VTT platform in every box set, book, video game, and any other D&D paraphernalia sold. Talespire just simply can't compete with that. In 10 years, nobody will even know what Talespire is. With all that said, however, to truly detail how this business realignment will influence the game's culture, imagine how players interacted with D&D from 1974 till today. Players, especially while role-playing in the theater of the mind, had no issue dropping chandeliers on goblins, damming up a river to flood out a nearby ogre-infested dungeon, or whatever creative shenanigans players can come up with. And non-theater of the mind gaming is something I've acknowledged as an issue with physical tabletop terrain as well. Miniatures and terrain limit the creativity of players at the table, but virtual tabletops? That just adds another layer of obfuscation. Physical miniatures and terrain can be picked up and manipulated by the players at the table, even the parts of the terrain set that the virtual tabletop likely forbids, like walls, doors, trees, or even whole buildings. These impulsive and physical manipulations of the tabletop terrain can invite creative use of player spellcasting, for example. In virtual settings, however, it only follows that players will likely succumb to the even more limited and constraining effects of the software itself. If an interaction with the software isn't easy to conduct, and it isn't an obvious option, players won't even think to do it. Moreover, because the new virtual tabletop engine developed by Wizards of the Coast already feels so much like a video game, as demonstrated by the concern-hushing statements in the launch video,
so that people understood that this wasn't a video game?
Players will likely bring their video game playing expectations with them. Expectations where environment manipulation just isn't worth the CPU cycles to program in. I know people in the argument section are going to counterstate about how Roll20, Owlbear Rodeo, or even Talespire virtual tabletops already experience many of these problems. But these VTT systems are not the default method of experiencing D&D today, and are designed by smaller development teams with limited budgets for marketing. Furthermore, this new development also sets the standard for any other RPG system on the market market that younger players might try. Integrating a D&D game into Roll20, for example, is difficult. It requires lots of setup, experience with the persnickety interface, and doesn't offer integrated DMing tools like a random adventure generator that can be set up with just a few button clicks. Contrast this with what's likely to happen with 1D&D's virtual interface. Dungeon Masters will probably load up an entire 2-scale 3D battle map of Faerun's Sword Coast with pre-generated random encounters and adventures and pre-populated towns. Players who are just 10 years old today are just going to expect this stuff if they're to be convinced to try a different gaming system like Call of Cthulhu, Vampire the Masquerade, or Shadowrun, and that leads us to our next issue. It's only a matter of time before the digital sales of D&D content will largely be pulled from one bookshelf's DM's Guild and drive-through RPG platforms, so as to be shifted to a 1D&D virtual tabletop store. And as much as indie game developers may dislike this, the jagged pill to swallow here is that drive-through RPG does a huge service to the independent game community by simply exposing 5th edition players to these smaller fringe RPGs. And when I say fringe, I'm including heavy hitters like Call of Cthulhu, World of Darkness, and Shadowrun. When over 50% of all Roll20 campaigns are created for 5th edition, and the next largest system, Call of Cthulhu, squeaks by at only 10% of campaigns, it really illustrates how much every other RPG rule set struggles for any visibility at all. But when 5th edition content is no longer available on platforms which sell content for these other games, the organic discovery of these smaller franchises will become more and more difficult to carry out. And it's not just smaller independent RPGs which will have their discoverability nerfed. Game writers who use the DM's Guild content license agreement to create Faerun, Eberron, or Ravenloft content sign a contract between Wizards of the Coast and One Bookshelf, the company that owns DM's Guild, to earn 50% of any published content sales while using WotC IP, while Wizards of the Coast retains rights to the created content. This might be a fine trade-off for people who are happy to make adventures for one of D&D's campaign settings in exchange for the visibility, but these creators, at the very least, are able to maintain some kind of tangible record that can persist over decades. A PDF or printed booklet goes a very long way in the perpetual longevity and discoverability of this licensed content. This is why I, today, can still play my favorite adventure, Janelle Jaquaiz's Caverns of Thracia, 43 years after its publication. This kind of experience is the definition of generational gaming.
There's very little that persists that long that becomes generational.
However, adventures programmed in this virtual-first oriented 1D&D system, instead of creating generation enduring written content, will instead be wound up in a non-durable, non-migratable system with microtransactions. You just can't make a PDF or a booklet out of a programmed event tree. One of the biggest hurdles of being a Dungeon Master is the unspoken financial expectation that Dungeon Masters will pay for basically everything. Dungeon Masters buy at least 3 times as many books, if players buy any books at all, and commonly provide the dice, miniatures, battle mats, terrain, and so on. With that said, the fact that there's only one person in the group with 3 to 5 players who makes the majority of the purchases isn't missed on Wizards of the Coast. And yet again, 1D&D's new virtual game space solves this WotC marketing problem too. If Fortnite is any indicator, players love to spend only 99 cents on avatar skins, special weapons, or who knows what else they can get through various microtransactions. And don't think for a second that 1D&D would be any different. There will be no shortage of premium avatar poses, equipment loadouts, and even environmental asset packs for Dungeon Masters. D&D Beyond already has dice skin microtransactions after all. Therefore, between these player microtransactions and Dungeon Master third-party content being tightly wound up in 1D&D's platform, Wizards of the Coast will have created the Apple ecosystem equivalent of Dungeons & Dragons. I'm sure you've heard a few people lament that they would give Android phones a try, but between their iPhone, their iPad, their iWatch, their AirPods, and their MacBook Air, they're as hesitant to do so as they are locked locked into the Appleverse. Similarly, the younger Dungeons & Dragons community will have even more reservations from abandoning not just a rule system they're comfortable playing, but all their assets purchased via microtransactions. Letting all that stuff go just to play in their imagination at an actual table will be less and less appealing to the more dominant 1D&D's virtual tabletop experience. I hope I'm totally mistaken and that all of this effort somehow fosters more generational gaming innovations, but I just don't see that happening. If you'd like to help me make more content like this in the future, please consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a channel member. Thanks for watching, Dungeon Masters, and until next time, good night.